The rain tapped gently against the massive glass windows of Daniel Sterling's mansion. A quiet rhythm, lost in the heavy silence that filled the room. The grand chandelier above cast a warm golden glow, but it did little to soften the tension, pressing down on the space. Daniel, a self-made millionaire, sat at the head of his long mahogany dining table, his fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of whiskey. His son, Ethan, sat across from him, his face unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something different tonight. Daniel had built his empire from nothing. Every brick of his fortune was laid with sweat, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief that wealth was the ultimate security. He had raised Ethan in privilege, ensuring his son had everything Daniel himself had once longed for. Private schools, luxury vacations, the finest things money could buy. But in doing so, Daniel had always expected something in return: respect, loyalty, and above all, an understanding that the Sterling name was more than just wealth. It was power. But tonight, something was off. Ethan had asked for this conversation, insisted on it, in fact. And now, as the storm outside grew heavier, Daniel felt a strange unease creeping in. He had faced boardrooms full of ruthless executives, fought off competitors who would have killed for his downfall. But this was different. His own son sitting across from him, quiet, hesitant. It was unsettling. "You said you had something to tell me," Daniel said, his voice even, but laced with an edge of impatience. "So say it." Ethan exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself. He looked down at his hands for a moment before finally lifting his gaze, locking eyes with his father. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there's something I've been carrying for years, and I don't know how you'll react, but I can't hold it in anymore." Daniel's grip on the whiskey glass tightened slightly. "Go on." Ethan swallowed hard, then finally spoke the words that would change everything. "Dad, I don't want your money." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, louder than the storm raging outside. For a moment, Daniel thought he had misheard. His mind struggled to process what Ethan had just said. A slow, bitter chuckle escaped his lips. "You, what?" His voice was sharp now, a mixture of confusion and something else. Anger. "What are you talking about?" Ethan's shoulders tensed, but he held his ground. "I don't want the business. I don't want the inheritance. I don't want any of it." His voice didn't waver, even as he saw the disbelief flashing in his father's eyes. "I've been living in a world you created, trying to be the son you wanted. But it's not me. It never was." Daniel leaned back, shaking his head as if trying to snap himself out of a bad dream. "You're joking," he said flatly. "I'm not." A long, suffocating silence stretched between them. Daniel's mind raced. This was the son he had molded, the heir he had prepared to take over everything he had built. And now, this? "So what do you want then?" Daniel asked, his voice low, but laced with sharp edges. Ethan inhaled deeply before answering. "I want to walk away. I want to live my life on my own terms, without your money controlling me. Without you controlling me." Daniel felt something in his chest tighten, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Not since his own father had looked him in the eye and told him he would never amount to anything. And now, here he was, the father, the one being rejected. The storm outside crashed against the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside him. His son, the boy he had given everything to, was choosing to throw it all away. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his life, he had no words. And then Ethan spoke again, and this time, His words would paralyze Daniel in a way he never thought possible. The room felt colder now. Despite the golden glow of the chandelier and the crackling fire in the distant corner, the silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the occasional roll of thunder outside. Daniel still hadn't spoken. He just sat there, his expression unreadable, gripping the edge of the table as if trying to anchor himself. Ethan knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the way his father was looking at him, as if he were a stranger, made his stomach twist. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. Dad, I know what this means to you. I know how hard you worked to build everything, but I need you to understand. I never wanted this life. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through. I've been trying to be the son you expected, but every part of it feels wrong. The business, the pressure, the money, it's suffocating. Daniel finally exhaled, slow and measured. When he spoke, his voice was eerily calm. Suffocating? He gave a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. You think the life I gave you was suffocating? His gaze darkened. Do you have any idea what real suffocation feels like? Do you know what it's like to claw your way out of nothing, to fight for every single thing you have, to build something with your bare hands, only to have your own son throw it back in your face? Ethan tensed, expecting this reaction. I'm not throwing anything back at you, Dad. I respect what you built. I do, but I can't live in your shadow. I need to make my own choices. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His piercing eyes never left Ethan's. And what exactly do you plan to do then? His voice carried an unmistakable challenge. You think the world is waiting for you with open arms? That without my name, my resources, you'll just walk out and find success? Ethan hesitated. He had expected resistance. But there was something else in his father's tone. Fear, maybe. Or was it betrayal? He wasn't sure. I don't care about success in the way you do, Ethan said. I want something real. Something that isn't about board meetings and stock prices. And proving our name means something. Daniel scoffed. You sound naive. He shook his head, pushing back his chair. The world isn't kind to people who just want something real, Ethan. It eats them alive. Ethan clenched his jaw. Maybe. But I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on yours. That stung. Daniel's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his carefully controlled composure cracking just slightly. You think you can just walk away? Daniel said, his voice lowering. Like it's that simple. Ethan took a slow breath. Yes, and I am. Daniel laughed, but there was no warmth in it. You don't get it, do you? You were never meant to have a choice. You were raised for this, groomed for this, and now because of what? Some feeling in your gut, you're throwing it all away. Ethan met his father's glare, head on. You don't own me. Daniel stilled. For the first time in years, he had no response. Ethan took the opportunity to continue. I know you think money solves everything, Dad. That power is the only thing that matters. But you're wrong. His voice was steady now, surer than before. You always saw success as a way to protect yourself, to keep control, but all it's ever done is make you afraid of losing it. Daniel's expression darkened. I am not afraid. Yes, you are. Ethan said quietly. You've spent your whole life making sure no one can ever take anything from you. But the truth is, you lost something a long time ago. And I think, deep down, you know it. Daniel's jaw tightened. He hated how calm Ethan sounded. Hated that, somehow, his son had turned this conversation into something deeper than just an argument about money. Ethan continued, his voice softer now. I've watched you, Dad. For years, you have everything, more than most people could ever dream of. But you're still alone. Daniel flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Ethan caught it. You built an empire, but in doing that, you built walls so high that no one, not even me, could reach you. Ethan said. His voice was gentle now, but it didn't lessen the weight of his words. And I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to be so consumed with winning that I forget what life is actually about. Daniel stared at him, his lips pressed into a tight line. He wanted to lash out, to tell Ethan he was being foolish, ungrateful, reckless. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his son was wrong. The storm outside raged louder. Now, the wind howling against the glass. It felt almost fitting, the chaos outside mirroring the storm, brewing within Daniel's mind. Ethan stood. I'm leaving in the morning. Daniel's eyes flickered with something unreadable. And if you fail, his voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. Ethan gave a small, sad smile. Then at least it'll be my failure. Daniel watched him, his son, the boy he had raised, the heir he had built his future around, turn away and walk toward the door. For the first time in his life, Daniel Sterling realized something terrifying. He wasn't in control anymore, and that, more than anything else, was what truly paralyzed him. Daniel sat alone in the dimly lit dining room, long after Ethan had left. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle. The silence in the house felt heavier now, like a presence pressing against him. He had spent years building walls of wealth, power, control. But for the first time, he realized those walls had trapped him just as much as they had protected him. Ethan was really leaving. Daniel had always assumed his son would eventually fall in line, that he would see reason. But tonight, something in Ethan's eyes told him that wasn't going to happen. The boy wasn't just rebelling. He was choosing something Daniel couldn't understand. A life without guarantees. A life without power. A life without him. The thought sent an unexpected ache through his chest. For years, Daniel had told himself that he was doing all of this for Ethan, that the empire he had built would be his son's greatest inheritance. But now, looking back, he wasn't sure if he had done it for Ethan at all. Maybe it had always been for himself. The house felt impossibly empty the next morning. Daniel woke up, expecting to hear Ethan's footsteps in the hall, the faint sound of his voice on a call, or his car pulling out of the driveway. But there was nothing, only silence. Ethan was gone. Daniel told himself he didn't care, that his son would come crawling back once he saw how unforgiving the real world was. He buried himself in work, attending meetings, closing deals, ensuring the business continued running like the well-oiled machine he had built. But something had changed. He found himself distracted, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind, the way Ethan had looked at him, not with anger, but with sadness. The way he had spoken, not as a rebellious child, but as a man who had made peace with his choice. And then, one night, Daniel found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He picked up his phone and searched Ethan's name. He expected to find nothing, or maybe a vague mention of him distancing himself from the family name. But what he saw surprised him. Ethan was doing fine. Better than fine. Actually, there were articles about him, small at first, but growing in number. He had started something of his own, something far removed from the corporate empire Daniel had built. A non-profit, helping struggling small businesses get back on their feet. It wasn't about power, or wealth, or dominance. It was about people. Daniel scoffed at first, telling himself it was naive. that Ethan would learn soon enough how the world worked. But the more he read, the harder it was to ignore the truth staring him in the face. Ethan was happy, and for the first time in his life, Daniel questioned everything. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel never reached out. He told himself it was pride, or maybe stubbornness. But deep down, he knew it was something else. Fear. Fear that Ethan would see right through him. Fear that if he called, he wouldn't know what to say. Fear that his son had moved on without him. And then, one evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the city skyline, his phone rang. Ethan. Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the screen. A part of him wanted to let it go to voicemail, to pretend he was too busy, too important to pick up. But another part of him, the part that had been slowly unraveling since the night Ethan left, picked up. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then, "Hey, Dad." Daniel swallowed. "Ethan." Another pause. "I just wanted to check in," Ethan said, his voice careful, uncertain. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He could feel the weight of years between them, of unspoken words and stubborn pride. For a long time, Daniel Sterling had believed that power was everything, that wealth was the ultimate measure of success, that control meant security. But now, listening to his son's voice on the other end of the line, he realized something. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change that.